Top 10 youngest kids to be put in jail. Hey there, YouTube. Now I have no real intro for this one because a title like this kind of speaks for itself. The children listed here are nothing more than cold-blooded killers and honestly deserve everything that's coming to them in this entire list. So without further ado, here are the top 10 youngest kids to be put in jail. Number 1. Danny and Ricky Preddy, 13 and 12 years of age. These two young boys were jailed after their third trial in court after creating bloodshed on a 10-year-old boy named Damilola Taylor back in November of 2008 as he was walking back from the Peckham Library located in southeast London. The cause of his death was that he received a huge gash to his upper left thigh from a broken bottle. Damilola ran as far as he could and he finally met a stairwell, and sadly once he arrived it only took him 30 minutes to lose an unsafe amount of blood and there died in the worst place possible. To conclude, the two brothers, Danny and Ricky Preddy, were sentenced to 8 years in youth custody. Number 2. Eric Smith, age 12. It was just like any other day for Eric as he was riding his bike in Steuben County, New York, but while riding he had bumped into 4-year-old Derek Robbie who happened to be walking alone at the time. And trust me, this is not for the faint of heart. I must continue this next part of the crime this young boy committed. Eric lured 4-year-old Derek into a wooded area, dropped 2 large rocks onto his head, and then began to sexually mistreat his body with a twig. Eventually, Eric was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to the maximum term, and then he would eventually be able to be tried juvenile murders, which is a minimum of 9 years to life in prison. Eric Smith has been constantly denied for parole, 8 times to be exact, since the year of 2001. Only in 2018 will Smith be able for parole. The court psychologist said that because Eric expressed the event without any emotion, he could never be fully rehabilitated and released into society. Number 3. Lionel Tate, age 12. Lionel Tate is the youngest American citizen to ever be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility for parole. Now, to continue to the crime at hand, Tate was left alone with 6-year-old Tiffany Unick, who had at the time being babysat by the mother of Lionel, Kathleen Gossett Tate. After only 45 minutes of playtime with the little girl, Tate anxiously called for his mom, saying that Tiffany wasn't breathing, because what the mother didn't know is that Tate had the little girl in a headlock and banged her head on the table. Her injuries were so severe they ranged from a lacerated liver to a fractured skull, broken rib, and a swollen brain. The prosecution said her injuries were consistent to those that would have sustained if she had fallen 3 stories to the ground. Tate stomped on the helpless girl until she couldn't fight the constant blows to her upper body. Despite the drastic events that took place in this crime, the prosecution joined plea for leniency in the sentencing and had offered to help with Tate's appeal in court. He was released on the condition of 1 year's house arrest and 10 years probation despite his leniency in court. Tate then chose to commit further crimes of the same caliber as 6-year-old Tiffany Unick. Lionel Tate is planning to be released for parole in the next year, 2018, and I'm hoping he kinda gets denied it. Number 4. Joshua Phillips, age 14. In 1998, Joshua Phillips gave his statement to the police that he was apparently playing with a baseball bat at his home in Jacksonville, Florida, when he hit 8-year-old Maddie Clifton in the eye, causing it to bleed. Phillips said that he had claimed that he quickly panicked because of the fear of his father's reaction, and for some reason the most rational decision was to strangle her with a phone cord and stab her 11 times. Joshua then proceeded to hide her body in the pedestal part of his waterbed, where his mother then discovered her body some weeks later. While the autopsy didn't reveal any kind of sexual assault, Maddie's body was found bare from the waist down. The murder appeared to have been motivated by the fears of Phillips' abusive father, who would have done awful things if he found out that he hurt his little sister. In the end, Phillips, who had no history of violence, was charged as an adult with murder. He was also found guilty in the court of law of the murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in prison without any chance of parole. Number 5. Craig Price, age 15. At the age of 13 in 1987, Price broke into the house 2 doors down from his current unit and impaled 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer 58 times, resulting in her death. Price hadn't become suspect of that case until confessing to the murder 2 years after the incident. Following the murder of Rebecca Spencer, Price went on to kill 3 other neighbors while he was high on marijuana and LSD. The victims after Rebecca Spencer were Joan Heaton, 39 years old, and her 2 daughters, Jennifer, 10 years old, and Melissa, 8 years old. They were speared over 30 times. Their wounds went so deep that the handle of the murder weapon had broken off, hence leaving the blades in the victims. In court, Price showed no emotion, and to further prove that statement, he then went on and mimicked the dying cries of the Heaton girls. Price refused to undergo psychological testing because fearing the results would cost him life in prison, so instead he was jailed for 25 years. But due to his violent behavior behind bars, it doesn't seem too likely that he will be released in that 25-year time expectancy. Number 6. Alyssa Bustamante, age 15. Alyssa Bustamante is an evil monster, by which she is said to be in court by the peers and the jury. Alyssa's crime was that she lured her 9-year-old neighbor Elizabeth Olden into the woods where she then began to smother, and then in a sense of finishing her off, Alyssa had cut her throat and wrists, and then grimly buried her in a shallow grave. Bustamante was a teen who had a troubled history of depression, self-harm, and numerous suicide attempts. She described the killing in her diary as this: "It was amazing. As soon as you get over the feeling of, oh my god, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. Kinda nervous and shaky right now. Okay, I gotta go to church now. LOL." Provided by an article on Mirror that spoke of the incident. Alyssa was charged with first-degree murder as an adult, getting a life sentence but with a chance of parole. Number 7. Jesse Pomeroy, age 11. Jesse Pomeroy, the son of a Civil War veteran, was born in Boston on 1859. When Jesse was at the age of 11, he had begun to lure young boys to certain remote areas to where by which he would beat the kids ruthlessly using his bare fists, a belt, and at times a knife. In 1872, he was finally arrested for the continuous attacks and then sentenced to a reform school. A couple years later, in 1874, Jesse was living back with his family when he ended up attacking 10-year-old Mary Curran and then later 4-year-old Horace Mullen. He had killed both of the youngsters, and their bodies had been discovered in the basement of the house. In discrete details, their bodies were, in other words, in pieces. Pomeroy was found guilty in the court of law and charged with murder in the first degree and sentenced to death by hanging, but 2 years later, in 1876, he was sentenced to life in solitary. Number 8. Willie Bosket, age 15.
It started out as a story about a young man named Willie Bosket who, as a boy, murdered a series of people on the subway in New York. And when I began to look into his record, I found that his father had also been convicted of murder.
Willie was born in Harlem, New York to a horrible father who had killed 2 people shortly after he was conceived and thereafter spent his whole life in prison. Willie was constantly in and out of trouble growing up. In other words, he was quite the violent child, and wore it as some badge to a point where he would tell juvenile authorities that he would be a killer, just like his daddy. I guess the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Sorry, I'm just trying to lighten the mood in here, but back to the story at hand. At the age of 15, Willie had committed his first murder where he shot and killed 2 men during 2 separate robbery attempts, and on top of that also killed a transport worker just before the police had gotten to him.
And then I found that his grandfather and great-grandfather had also been violent criminals, and eventually I traced the family back to a county in South Carolina which has long been known to historians as being one of, or perhaps the most violent county in the country.
Willie was put on trial as a minor and was sentenced 5 years in a youth facility. Although upon release at the age of 20, Willie continued his life of crime, constantly being in and out of jail until his luck ran out and was sentenced to a life in prison for assault and arson while in prison in 1989. Number 9. Mary Bell, age 11. On the day right before Mary's 11th birthday, she lured 4-year-old Martin Brown to an abandoned house in Newcastle, northeast England. This already sounds like it's off to a bad start. 2 months after her birthday, she smothered a 3-year-old Brian Howe to his death. The story of Bell's childhood is quite gruesome. Her mother Betty was a prostitute who had tried to kill her daughter on numerous occasions and tried to cover it up by calling it an accident. Class act. Also, on a certain occasion, an independent witness saw Betty giving her daughter Mary pills saying they were sweets. Sadly, Mary herself was subject to repeated sexual harassment due to her mother forcing her to be involved in sexual acts with men. During Mary's trial, the court-appointed psychiatrist said that she had displayed signs of psychopathic traits and that she also possesses a threat to other children and was sentenced to 12 years in a youth facility. After serving her 12-year sentence, Bell was released in 1980 and has had several stage names since the release from her sentence. Number 10. John Venables and Robert Thompson, both age 10. In 1993, John and Robert became the youngest convicted murderers in England after allegedly killing 2-year-old James Bulger. John and Robert began by, in a sense, kidnapping James from a shopping center in Bootle, Merseyside, and then took him to a rundown railway line where they began to torture the toddler. In vain, I must go on to tell the rest of the crime, and, again, it's not for the faint of heart. The 2 boys then threw paint in the eyes of the infant, kicked and stomped on him, threw bricks and stones at him, and then to finish him off, dropped a 22-pound iron plate on him. The autopsy stated that there were 42 injuries in total, and that nobody could be isolated as causing the fatal injury. John and Robert fled the scene with the 2-year-old James Bulger laid across the track weighted down. After they had fled the scene, the body was found in 2 pieces. After the trial and conviction, the 2 boys were sentenced to 15 years in prison. If it were in this day and age, they would be sentenced to 8 years in a youth facility, and then sentenced to the rest of their lives in prison. God, what horrible kids. I truly hope they're paying for what they did to that infant. Sorry, this list is actually really hard to talk about. And that is our video for today, everybody. So tell me, who do you think was the worst child in this entire list? Do you think that most of them deserve to be locked up for life, or do you think there are circumstances behind it? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, why not hit the bell icon to stay updated on all videos we put out for this lovely, lovely channel of ours. With that said, I'm heading out, and I'll see you all in the next video.